Alright, so today I want to show you several different ways to make a completely white pied ball python with no pattern or color at all. And when it comes to white snakes, I'd say it's pretty much everybody's favorite snake. Every time I'm selling snakes at a reptile show, everybody comes up to my display case and they ask me, hey, can I hold the white snake? And there's probably over 40 different ways to make a completely white ball python. Probably the most popular would be something in the blue-eyed leucistic, where you have two genes in the blue-eyed leucistic in a ball python. And kind of the tricky thing about that is a lot of times when you make certain combinations, sometimes you can get a white snake, sometimes you see a little bit of pattern kind of bleeding through your white snake. As a matter of fact, I've actually bred Bobby here, this bamboo ball python around my neck. This is actually in the blue-eyed leucistic. I bred Bobby to one of my lesser females and produced some pretty amazing bamboo lessers. And those bamboo lessers, they're white snakes with blue eyes, but they actually have a really faint yellow line right down the top. And a lot of people are looking for blue-eyed leucistics. It doesn't really matter if there's pattern or not coming through, but if you're actually looking for the brightest white where no pattern or color breaks through the white snake, let me tell you, you definitely want to go with the completely white pied ball python. Pretty much nothing that I'm aware of can break through the intense white of a pied ball python. So today I want to jump over the internet and I want to show you several different ways to make a completely white pied ball python. Alright, so I'm going to jump over here on Morphmarket.com and I want to start with this snake right here. This is a pied ball python. And essentially what the pied does is it brings in these big patches of white on the ball python. And keep in mind the pied is a recessive mutation, so you need two copies of the pied for a visual. And it's kind of interesting if you actually take two pieds and breed them together. Sometimes you get a high white pied and sometimes you'll get a low white pied with just a little bit of white. And it's pretty random if you're just breeding pied to pied. I've actually seen some people where it seems like if you actually take two high white pieds and breed them together, you get a higher percentage of high white pieds, although I've actually seen just the opposite where it's just kind of all over the place. But there's actually genes you can add to the pied to increase the amount of white or decrease the amount of white depending on the genes that you mix in with the pied. For example, you can actually take Enchi and work it into a pied, and pretty much every Enchi pied that I've ever seen has a really low amount of white, just a little bit of white. As a matter of fact, I've actually seen some Enchi pieds that you can't even see any white on the snake at all, and you're like, is that really a pied working Enchi into the pied? And usually with the Enchi pieds, I've seen just a little bit of white right on the bottom, but there's actually other genes you can work into the pied to increase the amount of white, and sometimes you can actually completely eliminate all the color and make a completely white pied ball python. So the first gene I want to show you is the spider, working spider into the pied. And the spider is kind of interesting. It's a really visually dominant gene. Usually when you work spider into other genes, you can see this really strong spider pattern in most of your combinations, unless you actually mix it in with the pied. So here's what happens if you take the spider and you work it in with the pied. I'd say probably 90–95% of the time, what the spider does is it pushes all the color just to the head of the ball python. And kind of the interesting thing with your spider pied combinations, if you have other genes in with the spider pied, you have to pretty much figure it out based on the color of the head. And in this case, you actually see this one's an albino spider pied, so you can definitely see the albino color and the red eyes giving you, the indication that the albino is in the mix. But every now and then, if you actually take the spider and work it into the pied, you get a completely white snake with no color at all. I actually pulled one up over here and take a look at this. I actually have one of these in my collection. This is a spider pied with no color at all. They call this the white wedding. It's kind of the slang name for the combination of the spider pied. And it's kind of interesting. I've seen a lot of these white weddings. It seems like what I've seen, it seems like they have just slightly larger than normalized. My ball python that's a spider pied has a slightly larger eye. Sometimes you'll actually get that with some of your blue-eyed leucistics. Sometimes you get larger eyes, and sometimes you'll get like micro eyes with certain combinations, which is kind of interesting with this combination. So here is the lesser. The lesser is actually in the blue-eyed leucistic complex, and I'd say the lesser is pretty much the king of combos when it comes to the white snakes. You can take the lesser and mix it with any other gene in the blue-eyed leucistic complex, and pretty much 100% of the time you get a completely white snake. Every now and then you'll actually get some combinations with just a little bit of color bleeding through your blue-eyed leucistics. But the kind of the interesting thing is if you take a lesser and work it into pied, every single lesser pied that I've ever seen is completely white with no pattern or color. So take a look at this. This is kind of interesting, working the lesser into the pied. And I actually have one of these in my collection too, a lesser pied. And kind of the interesting thing about my lesser pied is it has really bright blue eyes, which is pretty unusual for a snake that is not technically a blue-eyed leucistic. The lesser's in the blue-eyed leucistic, but you only have one gene in the blue-eyed leucistic complex, which normally doesn't give you blue eyes. And I've actually seen some lesser pieds with red eyes. As a matter of fact, if you actually take a look at this one, it kind of has like a blue on the outside and kind of red on the inside. I've actually seen some with really bright red eyes, which is pretty much the only snake in ball pythons that I've ever seen with red eyes that doesn't have albino in the mix, which is pretty unusual. It's one of the weird exceptions as far as the eye color in the combination. But if you actually take a look at any of these pied combinations, they are super stark white with no color, nothing breaking through this really white snake. They're absolutely spectacular. So here's another one that's kind of interesting. You can actually take the super cinnamon and work it into the pied to make a completely white pied. And the super cinnamon is kind of interesting, and a lot of times you'll actually have a dark brown, like a chocolate brown snake. And sometimes, like in this one, you almost get a completely black ball python, which is pretty amazing. These super cinnamons just by themselves are pretty awesome. And you take a super cinnamon and you work it into a pied. Take a look at this. You get a completely white snake. I'd say probably 99% of the time you'll get a completely white snake, but every now and then you'll get a little bit of color from the super cinnamon. I actually pulled one up over here. Take a look at this, and this is kind of interesting. I found this a couple super cinnamons over here that have a little bit of color, and the color on this almost looks like the color on a panda pied, which is the super black pastel pied, which is kind of an interesting combination. So it's kind of weird. It almost seems like at this point, a lot of people, pretty much, a lot of people think this the cinnamon is really close to the black pastel. Both of them are allelic, so you can actually have a cinnamon black pastel, which acts like a super. It almost acts like the same gene. But I'd say pretty much in this case, when you're working it into pie, this is kind of the division point between the cinnamon and the black pastel. So I actually pulled up a super black pastel over here, and take a look at this. The super black pastel can look almost like the super cinnamon, which is pretty amazing. And if you actually take the super black pastel and work it into the pied, you get the panda pied. And kind of the interesting thing about the panda pied is most of the panda pies are really high white with just a little bit of black. I'd say this is probably the most black that I've seen in any of the panda pies. And if you actually take a look at this black, it almost looks as black as this one. Take a look at this. It almost seems like you could make a panda pied using the super cinnamon instead of the super black pastel. But it seems like with the super cinnamon, most of the times you end up with a completely white snake versus you get a little bit more color, it seems like, with the panda pieds. Although you can make a completely white snake with the super black pastel and the pied. So take a look at this. This is actually a completely white panda pied. So this has the super black pastel and the pied in the mix. And kind of the interesting thing about this is take a look at the price on this thing. This is probably the most expensive all white pied that you'll find over here on Morphmarket. This actually sold in 2019 for $4,000, which is pretty amazing. So some of these, they'll actually sell from just a few $100s all the way up to several $1,000s, depending on which genes are in your all white pied, which is pretty amazing. So here's the last one I wanted to show you, and that is the Russo. The Russo is kind of interesting because it's actually considered to be one of the very first leucistic genes. As a matter of fact, they actually called it het leucistic when it first came out. It almost looks like it could be a recessive gene, because if you look at just the Russo, it almost looks like a normal ball python. But if you actually take the Russo and mix it in with certain combinations, it can have a pretty big effect. We can actually see the Russo in with some combinations. So it's definitely a co-dominant gene versus a recessive gene. But if you actually just take one copy of the Russo and you work it into the pied, you get a kind of an interesting effect. I'd say it's almost the same effect as the spider working into the pied. The spider really reduces the pattern, but I'd say in pretty much all cases, the spider will bring all the color to the head of the snake. And if you work Russo into the pied, a lot of times it'll really reduce the amount of color, but it's kind of random as far as where you see the color on the snake. Sometimes you get it a little bit on the tail, sometimes you get it like in the middle or on the neck, and sometimes you'll actually get a Russo pied with just color on the head of the snake. And if you actually look at the name of this is a pinto pied, which is kind of the slang name for the Russo pied. But every now and then you'll get a completely white Russo pied. Take a look at this. This is a completely white pinto pied, and I haven't even looked at the prices on some of this. So this one actually sold in 2019 for $700. So sometimes the prices on these can be all over the board. Really depends on the market too. I've actually seen a lot of the white snakes here almost double in price over the last few years. It seems like the prices are really increasing for a lot of these white snakes. All right, so it is time for the question of the day. And Mr. Danny Lane asks, is it possible to make a super sugar or calico ball python? And that is a very good question. So when it comes to the sugar and the calico, they're really similar genes. I'm pretty convinced that the sugar is exactly the same as the calico. And essentially what they do is they tend to bring some white up on the side of the snake, although it can be pretty variable. I've actually seen some calicos that don't bring hardly any white. They just really change the color. But if you actually work it into certain combinations, especially with bamboo, like the snake that I have around my neck. This is Bobby, my 7-year-old male bamboo. If you were calico into bamboo, it makes some really breathtaking combinations with some really high white up on the sides. And there's been quite a bit of debate over whether you can actually make a super calico or a super sugar. As a matter of fact, you can actually go over to morphmarket.com and search for the super sugar or super calico, and you'll actually see the super genes listed over there, although no one has ever posted a ball python with a super sugar or super calico. And I actually looked in all the different regions, the US region, the European region, and the South African region of Morphmarket. Not a single super calico ever listed over there, or a super sugar. And kind of the interesting thing too, I've actually been over on the World of Ball Pythons, where a lot of people will post the world's first to kind of take credit for it. A lot of times you can actually go over there, look up any gene or any combination, and down at the bottom of the page, people will list who actually produced that for the very first time. So I was actually over there looking for the super calico and the super sugar, and I didn't see one over there. Although I have produced some videos about the sugar and the calico in the past, and some people have chimed in and said that, hey, someone actually produced a super, which I've never seen it before, and if they actually did produce it, I'd probably go over to the World of Ball Pythons and take credit for the first time producing that. And keep in mind, if you produce a super, it would have 2 copies of that gene. It would be like the super calico has 2 copies, where if you actually bred it to something else, all the offspring would come out as calico, which would be pretty awesome. As a matter of fact, I actually have quite a bit of calico here in my collection, and maybe someday I'm actually going to breed a calico male to a calico female and see if I can produce a super calico. So that is pretty much it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.